defunding the police, is that really a good idea? Let's think about that for a second. Let's think about what happened with Mr. Brooks. If you look at the whole video, you'll see a man who did everything that he could to be helpful and compliant. Now, granted, he was intoxicated. Granted, he had been operating a vehicle. And the police were called. And the police have certain protocols. But things escalated. And there's a lot of different things that folks are saying that Mr. Brooks took the taser, and that under Georgia law, taser is considered a lethal weapon. And that he was resisting arrest, and he was fleeing the officer, and he had a criminal record, and he'd been abusive with his wife, or the women in his life, and he'd been abusive with the children, and he had just all these other sorts of things that were going on with him. When I watched the video, I saw a man running away from another man, fleeing for his life. And yes, he had taken the taser, and from what I understand, the taser had already been discharged and couldn't have inflicted any damage to the officer anyway, even if he had hit him. And also, it was like a flailing shot over the shoulder. It wasn't like he stopped and squared up and took solid aim. He shot over the shoulder and kept running. And so from my perspective, it looks for all the world like the officer shot a fleeing man in the back. And it wasn't a man who was fleeing to go do something worse. It wasn't a man who was armed and fleeing to go rob a bank, or to shoot up a school, or to commit some other crime. It was a man who was afraid for his life. So if anything, when Mr. Brooks did fire off the taser, he was doing so in self-defense. Because according to his paradigm, the world that he lives in, the cop was a predator. That's how he saw the police officer. Even if the officer wasn't. That you have to account for the fact that most likely Mr. Brooks saw the officer as an immediate threat to his life. And he was acting in self-defense. And what I've been saying throughout this is that all the cops really needed to do was to defuse the situation. They could have called him an Uber. In fact, I believe he even asked them to just call him an Uber and send him home. He didn't want to escalate it. He knew that he was in trouble. He knew that he'd done something wrong. He knew that he'd done something against his parole. Like, he knew. And that's why he was being so polite and trying to cooperate. So in hindsight, it would have been smarter for the officer to say, you know what? Let's call you a cab. Let's call you an Uber. Let's get you a lift. Let's get you home. All right? We'll mail you a ticket, and we'll sort all this stuff out in the courts. See what we can do. But police officers aren't trained to do that. And I'm learning more and more that a lot of citizens don't like that response. And that is very troubling to me. That a lot of the citizenry doesn't understand that. Because that points to a lot of other larger problems that we have in our society. One of which, and possibly the most significant, is our style of parenting in the West, where we tend to escalate things. I used an example earlier in a different conversation about when my 3-year-old daughter starts throwing a temper tantrum. I have several choices, but the two primary choices are I can try to outwill her during her temper tantrum, Or I can try to find out why she's throwing a temper tantrum. I have the superior strength. I have decades more experience. I could easily inflict my will on my child and tell her, you are going to stop this temper tantrum now. I could do that. But what would that do to her? What would that accomplish? And do I really want a daughter who's just going to obey me out of fear? Or do I want to have a daughter who will want to work with me out of love? So the one choice is to use my force of will, my superior strength and intellect and experience to like force her to stop the temper tantrum. Or I could be a loving, kind, and generous parent and realize, oh, she needs a nap. Oh, I did tell her she could get that toy, but I wasn't thinking because I forgot about that other thing. So now I need to like, appease her in some way and explain to her what's going on. Or maybe she's just hangry because she hasn't eaten anything for a while. Or maybe. But get to the root of the problem of why she's throwing the temper tantrum and help her learn how to diffuse her own emotions, diffuse her own anger, and learn emotional stability on her own so that when she becomes an adult, she's learned how to stabilize herself emotionally. It's the harder option, but it's the right option. I believe that defunding the police is a very good idea. And I believe that because people like Mr. Brooks didn't need a cop. He didn't need a gun to his back. He didn't need to be shot. Instead, what he needed was a cab ride home. And needed a friend. He needed a mentor. Maybe he needed somebody on the police force who was, a crusty old sergeant or something like that to come along and say, listen, man, what are you doing with your life? Let's sit down and talk. Let's go into that room that has the one-way mirror and everything like that, but do away with the one-way mirror. And let's just put some chairs in there, have a cup of coffee, smoke, whatever. Let's just talk. I had many conversations like this with airmen over the years as a non-commissioned officer. And my approach was always, what can I do to help you unfuck yourself? Because you fucked up your life. How do we unfuck you? That's what Mr. Brooks needed. And if we defund the police and have fewer officers who can focus on sorting out the backlog of rape cases, perhaps, or can respond to traffic accidents, or can respond to those sorts of things where we need police officers to, keep the justice, but then in, say, situations with somebody like Mr. Brooks, maybe send an officer to respond to make sure that everything's safe and he's not armed and everything's crazy. But as soon as that is established, call him the social worker, call him the mentor. Say, hey, we have an African-American male who has a criminal record and he's been, operating a vehicle under the influence. He's breaking his probation. And, we need a social worker to come down and help him. He needs to be brought into this program so that we can rehabilitate him. And further than that, we could take the funds away from the police department and put it into the education system. Make sure that people like Mr. Brooks have vocational training, or that they have, the resources that are needed so they can have an education, so they can have financial opportunities outside of the life of crime that seems to go along with so many of these communities. I mean, this isn't rocket science. This is not rocket science. And the only reason that I can see why people don't want to do this is that people prefer to come at these situations from ego. And you cannot do that. There's that old cliche of, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The pressure just like builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. So if you picture a glacier coming up against a mountain, there's tremendous pressure there all the time. And eventually, one of those is going to have to give. The mountain's going to have to break, or the glacier's going to have to disintegrate. Or everything's going to be like rupturing and bursting all over the place. And nothing's ever going to change. And that's what we have right now. We have the police who are under tremendous pressure from the civilian population to do an absolutely impossible job. Coming up against communities of color who lack education, who lack financial resources, who are up against, whether you believe it or not, some sort of systematic racism because of how the system was set up in the first place. And there they are. Tension. So what you do is you start to say, hey, I'm going to release a little bit of this, I'm going to release a little bit of this, 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 and then you can diffuse the whole thing. The problem is that in order to start pulling that apart, you can't live from ego. You have to go back to the story of the 3-year-old, where rather than trying to just like escalate and absolutely exercise my will against a 3-year-old because I'm the authority and I'm the parent and I'm the blah, 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 I say, oh, this is my child. This is my child who has a tender heart. And I need to care for her. So the police need to realize that the Black communities are humans with tender hearts. Hearts that have been broken for years and years and years. And the people of color in those communities need to realize that the police are humans. And they have tender hearts. And they've been under way too much pressure, asked to do an absolutely impossible job. And both sides need to release those egos a little bit. And it starts with people like Mr. Brooks, calling him a cab. And then working with the officer, getting him through de-escalation training. He's probably traumatized right now. He murdered a human being. I mean, it's not natural. And I'm sure he's not a psychopath. I'm sure he's a decent human being who thought he was doing his job, who was just doing everything according to protocol. And now he has this image in his mind for the rest of his life of pulling a trigger and killing a person. What do? You come at both sides with compassion. That's your only option at this point. It's the most difficult option. But like my father always says, if the right thing to do was easy, more people would do it. So, do the right thing. I love you. Hope you're doing well. That's my perspective. I hope it helps. Talk to you soon.